What is your passion? What brought you to business ownership and specifically in this industry?
I started my first business when I was 13 years old, so I've always had an entrepreneurial bent to myself. I started building bicycles and fixing bicycles when I was 13. So I started my first software company about 2 or 3 years into my career and never really looked back.
Well, speaking to those risks as well, what would you say is the biggest mistake that you've made in your business?
It's an interesting question, and I think all of us in business think about that all the time because most of us are, by nature, most entrepreneurs have to be hard on ourselves and have to learn. A lot of times we may not have a large contingent of people outside of our close-knit family or friends to tell us how badly we screwed up. And as I look both at my career and myself, and at times when I've been more engaged and others, one of the things I want to separate a little bit is the difference between engagement and tethering.
Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Jill Simonds. I founded Savvy Strategic Partners. We are a full service fractional C-suite who are executing vision, increasing business value, and helping founder owners realize freedom. Welcome to Vision Untethered, where we explore what it means to be a true visionary. Each episode dives into the heart of entrepreneurial journeys, starting with professional reflections and what kind of visionary each of our guests are. Too often, business owners find themselves tethered to and held back by their businesses. The business, as a result, essentially is held back because it can't operate independently of the founder, stifling innovation, expansion, and long-term growth, value, and sustainability. So we'll authentically unpack with some of my favorite visionary founders and leaders what mistakes they've made, whether it's life or in business, strategies to overcome them, and then identify the saboteurs that keep us tied down. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, my guest today, Tim Reeser. Tim Reeser is currently CEO, Fleet eForce, a service and support provider for commercial EVs, and serves on the Colorado Clean Fleet Enterprise Board. Prior to this year, Tim was CEO and co-founder of Lightning eMotors, which manufactured and sold zero emissions vehicles and power strains and the associated charging and telematics technology solutions for fleet vehicles. It was then publicly listed and sold in Q1 of this year. Congratulations on that too, by the way, Tim. Thanks for being here.
Honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, excited to have you. So diving right in, such an extensive and impressive background, specifically in e-motor and zero emissions and everything that you've accomplished up to this point. I'm curious first, what is your passion? What brought you to business ownership and specifically in this industry?
So I started my first business when I was 13 years old. So I've always had an entrepreneurial bent to myself. I started building bicycles and fixing bicycles when I was 13. By the time it grew to motorcycles when I was 15 and 16, and then grew to hot rods when I was 17 to 22, put myself through mechanical engineering college, building hot rods. So each of those, I had a business. I enjoyed all aspects of it. So even though obviously at the start, just doing the marketing for how you set up finding customers in the hot rod business and setting up all of the financials and business items. So those were things that I had a keen interest for. When I graduated mechanical engineering school, I went to work for a large conglomerate for Teledyne at the time, and realized very quickly that I needed the freedom and wanted the freedom to run my own company. I felt like I could at that time, young and arrogant, like I could do everything better than what was the status quo at the time. I think the big driver was I remember the first pay raise opportunity at Teledyne. I was working about 80 hours a week, really trying to prove myself and prove that I was a worker. And it came time to get pay raise, and I got a 4% pay raise, and other people around me got a 3%, and that was a big deal. And I thought, yeah, this isn't what I had in mind. So realized pretty quickly I needed and wanted to break the mold and do something different. So I started my first software company right about 2 or 3 years into my career and never really looked back. I like the entrepreneurial aspects. Obviously, as you look back and look at the risks you took as well as the returns, you may or may not have gotten from each of those risks. I think you get a little savvier at times, but you still don't always understand the risks. I tell everybody, you get in your car every day, you don't know what risk you're taking. So some days you're reminded, and other days you get to go scot-free. And a bit like Mr. Magoo, for those of us old enough to remember the cartoon or the movie, you may not have even known the dangers you faced for the day. So those are the nature of doing business.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking to those risks as well, what would you say is the biggest mistake that you've made in your business?
So it's an interesting question. And I think all of us in business think about that all the time because most of us are, by nature, most entrepreneurs have to be hard on ourselves and have to learn because a lot of times we may not have a large contingent of people outside of our close-knit family or friends to tell us how badly we screwed up. And that's obviously true whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're, C-suite in any business, that sometimes it's hard to get good feedback. But one of the things I'm famous for saying is hindsight is not 2020. So I like to say those people who grew up in the Back to the Future movie eras, you realize very quickly that you want to look back and say, if I had only, but a lot of times you don't know what would have been down the road to the left when you took the road to the right. So it sounds good on paper to say the road to the right didn't end up where I wanted it to, but that doesn't necessarily mean the road to the left would have ended up where you wanted it to either. So with that context of hindsight isn't 2020, for example, I've looked back and said, hey, for the last company, had we not taken it public, we wouldn't have had to sell it when we had to sell it. But at the same time, I look back and really, when I talk to friends or talk to other people who were involved in the company, they say, yeah, Tim, but we had to go public. That was during the COVID days. And during COVID, many of our venture capital partners who were funding the company had gotten cold feet, didn't want to continue funding the company. So the frank truth is, had we not gone public, we may not have survived. So it's an example of kind of looking back and saying, hey, I know what led to where I am, but I don't necessarily know if I'd done something different if the results would have been totally different. So certainly as I look back, even on my career, there are a lot of times where I feel like I didn't think big enough, didn't think about a big enough problem to solve. And really, but on the other hand, you also look back and say, hey, if I didn't have a lot of capital, if I was starting from very little, sometimes you have to grow organically and get to the point where then you can take bigger risks and go after something bigger. So as I look back, there's certainly a variety of things. I think most of us executives and entrepreneurs, usually one of the key things that we look back and say I would have done different is hiring certain people, or as I like to say, not firing certain people. So, and that's tough because we all are people oriented. We need teams. We need people in most cases to make our team successful. And in many cases, we can look back at the partners we had or the executive team we had and say, hey, they made me successful. But often we can look back and say, hey, had I not taken on that partnership or had I been more careful, I wouldn't be there. So I have a couple things that I do look back on that have become tenets of where I am today. One of them is I do spend a lot more money on lawyers today than I did before. I used to think I could do it all myself. It's pretty intuitive. I know it's here. And I certainly look back and I'm confident, again, hindsight not being 2020, but I look back and say, hey, had I hired a good attorney before I put that contract together, before I put that sale together, I would have been millions of dollars better off. And there's no question about that at certain points. Now, that isn't to say a great attorney will save you. I had some really, really good attorneys along the way. And sometimes there was no fixing the situations that were there. But certainly on some of the contracts, some of the M&A I did, some of the partnerships I did, I wish I had more legal advice along the way and really spent the money on an attorney. So I think that's one of them. The other tenet I have is hire fast, fire faster. And I think I've told a lot of people when we talk about culture, that culture of an organization is actually defined by who you fire, not by who you hire. And I think almost every executive I talk to in any group, when you look back and say, hey, why did you keep that person on so long? Everybody shakes their head and says, yeah, I should have fired him a year ago or 2 years ago or 2 months ago or whatever it was. And it would have been better for both people. So I'm not trying to be overly, sounding violent with fire the people, but I think it's important to note that for both people at times, making that when you see it and you realize it's not working, having the courage to make the change and move on. And it usually costs money. It usually has implications. So I'm not trying to oversimplify it, But those are the two tenets I really learned along the way: is set your culture by getting rid of the people who aren't working. And by the way, most of the time it's better for them as well, because they'll find a better spot too.
Absolutely. Yes. Amen to all of that. It sounds a lot like, for both of those tenets, to me, what stood out to me is it's about who, it really is who, not how. It's about the people from, from the start of the journey all the way through as well. And leaning on those resources outside of yourself to really help guide and build a strong foundation. There's a lot of costly people mistakes or partnership or vendor mistakes that we end up cleaning up and paying even more for had we really addressed, kind of legal protections better, or who you decided to work with in the beginning. So that stood out to me for sure. If you've heard of the book Who Not How, is that one that you
I
know
haven't.
of?
I will take it down as something to read, though. It sounds
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah. Who is in our circle and who's on our leadership bench are fundamentally really the backbone for strength and sustainability of the culture of the team as it grows. So great insights there. With that in mind, I'm curious, what are some key signs, whether that be people, structures, organizational structure and support accountabilities in the business, or anything outside of that? What are some key signs for you that an owner is too tethered to their business? And then how does that impact the company's ability to innovate and grow?
So Jill, I totally agree with the premise that there is a tethering. I think it's interesting, though, to look at, and I think obviously this plays into the question of engagement. And as I look both at my career and myself, and at times when I've been more engaged and others, one of the things I want to separate a little bit is the difference between engagement and tethering. I do think it's key that employees and owners be engaged and love their company and love what they're doing. I think the challenge, and I know you've spent a lot of time on this, is whether or not you're tethered to the extent that you think you have to do everything as the owner, or you think you have to control everything as the owner. Because it's one thing to be engaged and to really care. It's another thing to have an overblown expectation of what you're capable of, or an overblown expectation of what can be done from a single person vantage or from the owner vantage. So my key point there, I want everybody engaged. But I think the tethering, when I see an owner who isn't able to delegate, or when you ask them any question about the business, they don't speak about the rest of their team. They don't speak about the strength of the other people on their team. It's always about what they're involved in and what they're doing. And oftentimes when I've been in, many of us, are in a variety of groups with other CEOs or other business owners, and you see those business owners who are not just running their business, they're in the business. They're very, very active with every aspect of the business, as opposed to being able to have a great team who's doing a lot of that. That's when you realize it's just fundamentally limited, because there is only so much one person can do, whether you're talking about your intellectual capability to understand all aspects of the business, or whether you're talking about your time and execution ability to execute on all aspects of the business. It's just not possible to scale a business with one person. And it's not possible to scale a business with one person who believes they are smarter than everybody else or know more than everybody else. So my goal has always been, and as I look around, when I see other executives who say, hey, my CFO is brilliant and my CTO is brilliant and my et cetera, that my partner is brilliant, whatever it is, those are the people who often can scale and aren't overly tethered. But as soon as you see the people who really feel like they have to do it all and they're the only people in their business who can do it all, those are the people that fundamentally aren't going to be able to scale their business.
Absolutely. I love that distinction you just painted between the engagement versus being truly bogged down in the business, unwilling or unable to truly let go and delegate. Because I think that there is commonly confusion between a business owner either, stepping back or stepping away, as opposed to releasing and in freedom, allowing the team to step up and elevate and roles responsibilities that they've continued to hold on to, whether it be control, whether it be trust, whether it be fear of letting go of those things. Their engagement is so vital to that transformation that the team needs to take together. So it's not necessarily, oh, I'm going to drop this and, they're unheard of, unseen of, and nobody knows what they're doing. That environment and leadership that's required to effectively relieve yourself of, everything that it took, every role that you took on and every hat that you wear throughout that journey, take team involvement. It is a collaborative, engaged effort. So I love that you called that out. That's a key distinction of, disengaged versus untethered. So thank you for that. Can you share a story of a time you felt held back by your business or businesses in the past? What did you do to start untethering and freeing yourself from that?
Yeah, I think early on, the first business, the first business I started after school that was scaling, had a partner in the business, and very early on, it was, neither of us had much experience. Took on a 50-50 partnership, which I would never do again. I'm okay with being less than 50 or more than 50, but 50-50 has its challenges. And one of the challenges with that was both of us felt like we had to, run the company. And so we were both 50-50. And so we weren't able to really look at, no one else was able to come on and say, okay, I'm going to be a part of this because of the dynamics of two 50-50 partners trying to ego it out. And so I think it was an early example of, hey, you have to set up the business to scale and scale on lots of different leaders. It can't just scale on even two leaders unless you want to remain small. Certainly, if the goal is to just be a lifestyle business, you can probably get it done. But my goal has always been to be much more than a lifestyle business. And so I realized very quickly that tethering was, because I was tethered to a 50-50 partnership, that neither of us were able to look outside of that until one of us bought the other one out and said, okay, now we can forward with something to scale the business. And some of that was a function that 50-50 partnership didn't fully agree on. I wanted to scale the business. He was happy with a lifestyle business. And so when you have a fundamental disagreement on what you want out of the company, it's nearly impossible to do it. And so you end up just tethered to just trying to work it day to day instead of really being able to look at the business and say, okay, we've all agreed we're going to scale. What does that mean? How do we bring in the rest of the key people we need to make this thing
Right.
scale? And so I think, unfortunately, it is both a function of the other people you already have around you and in the business. It's also a function of at some stage capital, and at some stage vision, what you want to do. And so in the next business, the first thing I did was said, okay, I'm not going to set it up as a 50-50 partnership. This is going to be set up to scale. From the very beginning, said this is the vision, this is the scale, this is what I want. And so I think that's been key all the way along. And then the third one is certainly partnering with people who shared the vision for what we wanted ultimately out of the company, which sounds easy, but a lot of times people, when you first get into a business, don't know what they want. So it's not that they're being deceptive, it's that they don't know what they want out of the business until you get going. And so, and some people change what they want out of the business. Some people were happy with a lifestyle business and then decide they want to expand. Other people wanted to scale and then don't like the risk and decide they're happy with a lifestyle business. So that there has to be some continued agreement, and at times that requires a courageous or hard decision to exit that current partnership, and so that both parties can go do what they're passionate about it and what they want to do.
Yeah, vision is key, and alignment on that is key, especially if you were dealing with a partnership. So in your experience, what are some of the biggest mistakes business owners make that lead to becoming overly dependent in their involvement in the day-to-day operations of a team?
So I think one of them is hiring cheap people. Because especially in the early days, you may not have a lot of capital. I joke all the time when people say, hey, do you like to gamble? And I'm like, hey, every time I hire a person, I'm gambling. You don't know what's going to happen. So you look out and say, hey, I'm going to go pay this person a significant amount of money. What am I going to get out of it? And the frank truth is, you may not know what you're going to get for 6 months. And that's a lot of risk. That's a lot of money you're putting on the table for something that may or may not work. So certainly part of that is looking for a higher quality person and believing you can afford a higher quality person, because I think, especially in the early days, it's easy to go the cheap route and say, hey, I'm just going to get what I can afford here. And unfortunately, some of the time with people, you get what you pay for, other times you don't. But I think broadly, you've got to look out and say, I'm going to get the very best qualified person I can. And it probably means I got to pay a lot more than I thought. In many cases, I've paid high quality people more than I was making as the owner. And that's just what it took in order to grow the business. So I think one of them is pay for the very best talent you can get. Because again, as we're talking, if you want to untether the business, you've got to have people who are fortunately and hopefully better than you at many aspects of the business. So pick the stuff you can be in your genius territory with, and hire the people out that who are doing, who are hopefully going to be much better than you at the stuff that you may not be in your genius space with. And so I think that's the number one. Hire better people, hire extraordinary people. And that's hard. It's a big investment. It's a big risk because you may pay somebody way more than you thought and think you're getting somebody extraordinary. And they may be going through a
Yeah,
rough spot in life, or they may not be what you thought they were. And all of us have done that. I don't know of anybody who's hired somebody who didn't turn out
right.
to be what they thought they were. So that's just a risk of the business, but you got to take that risk if you're going to move forward.
Absolutely. That's a big one. Yeah, I think we've all been there, right? And we all learn the hard way. I think it's part of it.
Yes.
So,
Well, there's
yeah.
also no way to get to 100%, meaning I was talking, my uncle was one of the lead execs at Hewlett and Packard in 1980s,
Mm,
70s, 80s, 90s. And Hewlett Packard went through a very extensive look at how do you hire the right executives and hire the right people and everything. We've all kind of read stories about them and Apple and Microsoft, how you'd have a company-owned restaurant, you take them to a company-owned restaurant, you'd have the waiter script their order and see how so
mhm,
going to this length of work during the interview process and during the engagement process to figure out whether they're the right person, going through personality tests, psychological tests, background tests, reference checks, everything else. And yet he
mhm,
said even after perfecting all of that, they were about 60% success rate on their executives. So
mm,
his point, and that was very early in my career when he gave me that advice. He said, "You're never going to get to 100%, and it doesn't matter how good you are at hiring, it's never going to be 100%. So your business
mm.
success will be as much on how quickly you figure that out and move on versus how good you are at hiring." And that was always
Right.
insightful and something I've lived by.
And to your point then about the hire even faster, or sorry, fire even faster, because the longer we're holding on to that as something that we need to work out and already invested, and somebody not being the right fit for that role, the more damage is done by trying to make it fit and fit the square peg in the round hole, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it's much easier said than done. You and I both know that it takes
Sure.
a tremendous amount of courage to decide, hey, what I've got here isn't working. Usually it
Hmm.
costs a lot of money to fire a person too. And we worry about
Right.
lawsuits and you worry about, burning the bridges and you worry about all those things. And they're all legitimate concerns. So it's not easy. But I
Hmm.
think nonetheless, the successful people are ultimately separated. Occasionally you get lucky
Yeah.
with your first couple and it's great. But
Hmm.
for most people, if you've done it any length of time, those statistics will play out and you're going to have to make the hard decisions. And the quicker you can make those and move on, the better off the business will be.
Yeah, most definitely. So, how can business owners create systems and processes that allow their business to operate independently of their constant oversight? What are some wins you've seen from this throughout your years and experience?
So this is something you and I have talked some about because I know it's an area of your expertise, Jill, and something
Hmm.
I've become passionate about. Once I became
Hmm.
CEO of a public company, I all of a sudden got introduced to a whole different level of KPI discipline. And
Yeah.
as you look out at how you create that kind of discipline, now the flip side was as a public company, I had a lot more resources and to create the key performance indices. Because one of the challenges with creating the systems and the process and the disciplines, it takes investment, it takes money, it takes time, it takes people,
Right.
it takes data, it takes tracking the data
Hmm.
and the analysis. So in an early stage, it's often about just begin tracking anything you can track. And you
Right.
can't get bogged down by waiting till you have the next high-end system. Sometimes I think you got to start with everything. Just track it in Excel, track what you can track. If you can't track it by the second, by the hour, by the day, track it by the month. But you've got to
Mm.
start getting data because without the data, then you don't have anything to analyze in the future. Even if you don't have time to analyze it today, if you don't start gathering the data today, you won't be able to analyze it when you do have time in the future either. So the first part of it is start tracking the
Hmm.
data. And some of that is yeah, even QuickBooks has pretty decent tracking, but you've got to put the data in and you've got to be disciplined about making sure the data you put in is reliable, useful, and putting in as much data as you think you might need in the future. You can always not use that data and report, but putting more in is important. But whether you're talking about putting it in QuickBooks, whether you're talking about putting it in an MRP, an ERP, a NetSuite, any of those systems, I think you've got to have But again, a lot of people get bogged down saying, hey, I don't have the money for a
Yeah.
new ERP, MRP, whatever. And so they do nothing. And I think even if you start a
Hmm.
spreadsheet and track it in a spreadsheet or put it in your QuickBooks accounting package, something you have to do it. So the first
Yeah.
step is tracking relevant information. And you do have
Right.
to make the investment in sitting down and saying, what do we got to have? What do we got to track? The second thing is, yeah, you've got to become disciplined. And whether you do it or somebody else does it, or whether you outsource it, you've got to get some help analyzing that information and saying, okay, what is it?
Hmm.
And you've got to set aside and say, what is it from a KPI that we want to track? That's going to evolve. It's going to change. And a lot of times you get bogged down hoping to find perfection. I tell everybody, just start somewhere. Start with 4. If you're wrong, fine. You can add 4 later. You can subtract 4 later,
Yeah.
but start with something. So
Yeah.
build on the KPI and it's got to be from day one in a business. Start to have
Mm.
KPIs. Some people call them rocks. Some people call them anything else. But build the KPIs on what it is you want to do and what it is you want to track, so that then
Hmm.
you can begin to manage it. So. But it does
Yeah.
take resources. It does take time. You've got to build enough into your margin models and your business model to be able to have the luxury of being able to look at your data and analyze the data and therefore optimize it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that processes and systemization is start first with the data. What is it we're trying to control? What is it that we're trying to improve, optimize, et cetera? If we don't have point A, in state A, then how can we define goals for state B? So I love that you start there with that. That's so key. What are some common saboteurs, either for you or that you know of just as an entrepreneur, that prevent business owners from letting go, and how can they be identified and managed effectively?
So I think not to keep beating the dead horse, one of them is if you don't have good people, then you're constantly going to be filling in and fixing it for them. So, and then what you see a lot is those people aren't able to cut loose the dead weight or the people that aren't getting it done. And so they're just in a constant
Hmm.
loop of fixing a mess rather than resetting the clock and starting over with the mess. I think the second one
Yeah.
is, again, kind of reiterating what we just said. If you don't have the data, you can't actually fix it. You're just constantly guessing on what's wrong with your company.
Mm.
And so
Hmm.
it becomes a time sink and a tether sink. When you don't know what's wrong, you just try everything. You just guess at everything and you just throw money at everything. So maybe I need more marketing. Well, I don't know what marketing works, so I'm just going to try everything. And so those are all things that
Yeah.
play a role in terms of what we have and what we get. So I think
Hmm.
those two things are big saboteurs in terms of what you do with people, how you keep them from how you make them assets to your time management versus liabilities to your time management. And
Mm.
secondly, your systems. If you have good systems, you can manage it. If you don't, they'll become huge tethers.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. What about you personally? And anything from too, also like an emotional state or fear or control or, kind of the common mental saboteurs and mindset saboteurs. Are there any that stand out to you that you can think of that either early stage or that continue to kind of stick with you constantly in the back of your mind as big decisions or what next step or how far you go or what risks you take, that
Yeah,
affected you specifically?
certainly, and I think this is each of us are different, but I think
Hmm.
with people's side, I've always felt like I really my big concern was, hey, I don't want to burn bridges, and so there was always a fear of, hey, what's going to be the impact? What are people going to think? And I think broadly
Mm.
much of that is overblown, and I gave way too much energy and time to to the question, what are people going to think? Um, and so I
Yeah.
think that's one of them. I think there's always fear can be for me that the fear of failing was a motivator as much as it was a detractor. So it kept me working, kept me maybe overly tethered at times, but it kept me motivated in terms of keep rolling. But I think the other one was whenever one of the things that would often hurt me a lot was, hey, I've got a really good team member here and they're not engaged, or I've lost them, or they've decided to go take another job. Those
Mm.
would definitely have a sabotage effect on what I was trying to get done for the day or what the company was going to get done. So you've got a whole reset, and for me, that kind of abrupt change
Hmm.
required me to spend some time saying, what does this mean? Some self-reflection. Did I screw this up? Do they not like me? What's this going to mean in the future? And so I think for me, those were my saboteurs in terms of where the mind distractions came from and how you got distracted.
Yeah, those are good ones. Definitely common. I think the failure piece, what others think, can just hold us back immensely from steps forward. Yeah. So what strategies have you found effective in shifting from being hands-on and operator to visionary leader and focusing on the long-term growth and sustainability?
So I think the biggest thing is getting a team together and making that vision and long-term sustainability collaborative. Because
Hmm.
for me, again, being at times probably overly concerned about what people thought, part of what that leads to is a real desire to be collaborative. I want to know that the whole team is on board, but I
Hmm.
also want to know, I've always believed the people I hired, and especially in the last two organizations I've had an extraordinary team who really were fundamentally better than me at everything they were working on. And so I needed their input. It's not that I was just trying to be collaborative or felt that was the right kind of leadership style. I needed their input because I truly believe and still believe looking back, in most of the cases, they were the things I was asking for their input on. They knew the data better than I did. They had better inputs than I did and better outputs than I did in terms
Mm,
of the specific job I was asking them and the data I was asking them for. So I think ultimately having that collaboration with people, getting sometimes even offsite for a little bit, saying, who are we? What do we want to be? And
yeah.
those were things that ultimately always recentered me, put me back on track because I could leave that kind of event and say, okay, everybody's in tune, everybody's going down the same place. Now, to me, the easy part was I just have to go communicate the vision that we all agreed to and keep everybody on track to executing to that vision. And that
Hmm.
is still a big task because that vision had to be communicated
Definitely.
to employees, it had to be communicated to investors, it had to be communicated to the board, and frankly, it had to be re-communicated on a regular basis, even to the people who just agreed to it. Because you do get off track, you do lose it occasionally. It doesn't. There's always sometimes a more concise way to put that vision. So to
Yeah.
me, the recentering was always get the team together, really go through the tough questions, get some tough answers for it. And sometimes you couldn't get it in one meeting. Sometimes we'd say, okay, here's all the information or data we need to go gather before we can make a final decision on what the vision is going to be or what
Yeah.
route we want to go, whether we want to turn right here, go left here. But ultimately, that was my recentering is collaborate with the team and get all the input from the team. And then I felt like, okay, I can make the very best decision possible and we can go execute on it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. What role does a company culture play in all of that and enabling a business to thrive independently of the founder? So not, disconnected from, but independently from their constant, you talk a lot about collaboration. So what role does company culture play? And then how can leaders cultivate this?
So this was something I got to watch firsthand in Lightning as I grew it from, it really came from nothing to 350 people. And once you get past
Hmm.
about 50 people, the whole idea that the CEO can just state, here's our culture and have a culture is certainly naive at best. So I got
Mm,
a chance to watch what happens both organically and inorganically. And one of the things I got fortunate was I'd hired a really strong chief people officer and she sat us down collaboratively as a team and said, who do we want to be? What are our key, really ask the right questions. Who are we? What are our key
mm-hmm.
attributes? What makes us special? What do you want, Tim? What do you want the company to be? And I said, as I laid out, I want to be innovative. I want to take the risk to be an innovative company. I want to be a risk-taking company. I want to um, really enjoy the group, but I do want to be a hardworking. This is not a lifestyle company; it's a hardworking company. These were the
Mm-hmm.
things we set out, and once we set out those things, then she was able to then say, okay, every time we hire somebody, we're going to make sure that those things are out there because we did find out we'd hire people and they'd say, hey, I thought I was in a lifestyle company. I didn't know I was going to have to work this hard. Or other people who'd say, hey, I didn't know I was going to have to take this risk. I didn't know the company was going to have to change what they're doing, and I was going to have to be this agile and willing to take on a different project every day or every hour. And so we realized we were hiring the wrong people at times, or at least not setting the stage for the people we were hiring for what our culture was. And then once you've said
Mm,
for certain, this is what our values are, and therefore those are the people we want to hire or keep, then it also made it easier to early point to lay off, fire, allow to leave those people who didn't want to be in that culture. Because there were people as we grew from a company of 30 people to a company of 300 who didn't want to be in the company of 300. They enjoyed a little 30-person lifestyle company. And so they needed the
hmm
chance to exit the company in a very elegant way. And we
hmm
wanted them to be able to exit in an elegant way, but we needed, in order again to foster this culture, it's as much about who's leaving as who's coming. Because if you
Yep.
keep people who don't agree with the culture, the people who want, for example, to be in a lifestyle company, and you're not a lifestyle company, then it's going to be very difficult to convince the new people coming along that you're not a
Mm.
lifestyle company. So those bad apples do corrupt the good ones, and so very quickly, and it doesn't take much of that. A couple corrupting agents will corrupt tens of people. So it's a very leveraged proposition. So culture was about defining what the vision was, defining what your values were, then hiring to those values and exiting people on those values, and then that
Mhm.
created the kind of culture we ultimately wanted. And I
Mm,
really enjoyed watching that process, but it took a really hardened disciplined look at who do we want to be, what are those values. Everybody agreed to
yeah.
those, and then and some of them it was less collaborative in the sense the
hmm
chief people officer asked me, who do you want us to be, who does the board want us to be, who do the investors want us to be. And so it is a top down thing, and we all know that kind of sometimes that happens inadvertently, meaning many of us see companies that are undisciplined, and you look out and the CEO's undisciplined, and you say, okay, he may not have stated that's the values, but he set the example. So there is a point too for the CEO
Yep.
to say, these are my values, these are the values of the company. I had to exhibit those. I had to be hardworking. They had to see me working hard. If we're going to say the values of this company are hardworking, then the CEO
hmm
doesn't want to be engaged in it at the office every day. You're going to have a hard time executing on that culture
Yep.
vision. So that even in a bigger company, the culture is still highly influenced, not only by what we say we want to do, and not only by who we hire and who we fire, but also by what people see every day from the executive leadership team.
Wow, absolutely. Can you discuss a little bit the importance of self-awareness and your own personal development in that journey? Right? It's all awareness. Who are we? Who do we want to be? Who am I? Who am I with and without this organization? Who am I setting as an example? Right? What was kind of the importance to you in that self-awareness and your continual personal development throughout that journey in your businesses?
Yeah, I think for most people, self-awareness is emotionally challenging at times to come to terms with who we are, good and bad, from feedback, and also to try to reconcile that feedback. There were times, I remember there was one time where my board, we'd gone public, my board came to me and said, hey, we see a lot of dysfunction in your organization. Everybody's not rowing the same direction. This isn't working. And it was very difficult for me to hear. And in fact, in this case, this is going to sound overly defensive, but I went and looked and discovered that, they had gotten feedback from two people on my team, and one of the people on my team had said that. It wasn't really true, but it was true from her perspective. So from her
hmm
perspective, we weren't going the direction that she wanted us to go, and therefore the team was totally dysfunction and not going in the right direction. It wasn't because my leadership was broken. So I use that as an
Mm,
example, not as a defensive. There are certainly many other times where, yes, I had to say, hey, that these are weaknesses of mine, and these are challenges. So I don't want to sound like there's no weaknesses, but I'm saying one of the
yeah.
challenges with how do you get the right kind of feedback to make the right kind of changes, just like with any other data. If the data points you in a wrong
Mhm.
direction, or you take a small chunk of data and make a decision based on that, and indeed those may have been outlier pieces of data as opposed to the real piece of data, that's a risk even with self-introspection and getting to know yourself. So there were times where you get feedback and you're like, well, I want to be humble. I want to take the right kind of feedback. I want to say yes. But there are other times where you're like, well, is that really what's going on? Or is that one person's opinion who may be an outlier in the data stream? So I do think
Mm,
it's important to look carefully at where the information is coming from. I think it's
yeah.
also important to be humble enough to say, hey, can we change it? But for me, then, when I looked at that and said, okay, if those are areas where everybody around me seems to agree that aren't my strengths, can I fix them? Okay, Tim talks too much. Got it. So how do I surround myself with people? And this is kind of an interesting thing that I discovered along the way. If I surrounded myself with other strong leaders who wanted to talk and wanted to take the conversation, I didn't talk as much because I was happy to let them take the conversation. But if no one around me was saying anything, I tended to fill it in. And that was a weakness of mine. But some of the way I solved
Mm,
weakness was by surrounding myself with other people who had different strengths.
yeah.
That allowed me to solve that weakness of mine. Other times it
Yeah.
was, hey, I need to go get educated. I need to be more disciplined. I need to take this advice, and you go do it. But there are
Yeah.
other times where I just looked up and said, I'm never going to be good at that, or I'm not, I've tried all I can to be better at this or to change this, and I'm not capable. So how do I surround
Yeah.
myself with people who will fill that gap for me, solve that problem for me, make me better fundamentally, as opposed to thinking I can change myself that much? Because as humans, as much as I'd like to believe that we can all grow, and we do, there are fundamental parts of us
Right.
I'm not a good swimmer, and I've come to terms with the fact I will never be a great swimmer. It doesn't matter how hard I
Same.
try, it's not in me. It's not who I am.
I
And
know,
so,
right?
yeah, there are parts of that where I'm like,
Hmm.
hey, if this project's going to involve swimming, I better hire an Olympic swimmer because it ain't me. So we got to hire somebody to
Instead
run the
of
show.
forcing yourself out into the pool at 6 a.m. every day and hating life.
Exactly. There's just going to be times.
Yeah.
So I think there's both of those parts about getting to know ourselves.
Hmm.
Can we get more disciplined? Can we get better? Sure, but can we also recognize there's certain things I'm not
Yeah.
good at, and surround ourselves with people who are that can fill those.
Ah, so good. Yeah, that is self-awareness just painted in such a lovely picture. It's being self-aware, but then what we do with it, right? The awareness that it takes in the development within us to either solve for that weakness, whether that's our involvement, whether that's bringing somebody in, because at what cost are we sacrificing greatness, genius, strengths to try to course correct a weakness, right? So when that's taking away from, I think that it shows a great lack of awareness for where we apply ourselves and put our energy. When we know where we are each strong and where we know we need to lean on the unique abilities and strengths of those around us, rather than try to improve those weaknesses where someone else can just step in and do it far better than we ever will. So I love that. Yeah.
And to give you kind of after the first year of the board saying, hey, you don't have the team all rowing in the same direction. And like I said, I knew where it came from.
Mm.
That
Hmm.
individual ended up leaving the organization, replaced with another individual who was when I hired that individual, I was looking for somebody who really was on board with my vision. The next year, the board came back and said, man, we're just blown away by the change you've made. Everybody's rowing in the right direction. And I smiled because I knew the change was, I hadn't changed a thing other than one key
Who's
person
on the ship
looking
with
for the
you?
input, gave them a
Yep.
different input because they had a different perspective. And so anyway,
Mm.
again, I don't want there's been lots of other cases where, yes, the input was tough and I had to go make course correction for me personally or things I'd done. So
Yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like I don't think I've ever done anything wrong, but I do think there's a balance there that sometimes the perception is driven by data that may or may not be anomalous or that may be
Exactly.
driven by one
Yeah.
individual.
It's who's this feedback from? How valid is it? Is this true? And what
Yeah,
do
and
we
what's the
do with
context
it?
of it? Yeah.
Yeah, what's the context? What do we do with it? Is this something to act upon or not? But I think it's interesting, and I know none of that was in defense of you specifically. Maybe the data wasn't actually because of you, but they were right, right? That not everybody was rowing, and that was what
Indeed.
you fixed.
Right.
Because even if there's one person, they're not aligned with where the rest of the team is going,
Yep.
then you fix that issue, right? It was
Yep.
like, okay, this isn't a matter of, okay, the rest of the team seems to be jiving really well. All of us are rowing right here. There is a bad apple, right? There is somebody that, this doesn't fit with long term and you fixed it. So it's evident even if even one person doesn't have full buy-in or doesn't have, full alignment in where we're going, it's enough to really kind of sour the team. So you solving for that quickly, it probably saved a lot of other course corrects you would have had to make in the future if they ended up being kind of toxic to others. I've seen that happen so many times.
Yes.
So,
And this person wasn't a toxic person, but they were at a
mhm.
toxic place in their career. They were frustrated.
Yeah,
They weren't in the right role. They weren't in the right company. And so they
hmm,
become toxic, even though they were not. I would hire
exactly.
the person again in a different role because they were not a toxic person, but they were in a toxic
Sure.
place. And so it
Yeah.
was, but my first course, the way the board acted was I needed to change my communication or I needed to change my leadership style. And in fact, what I
Hmm.
needed to do was change a person. But again, to your point,
Yeah.
it was still a problem. The feedback wasn't wrong, that there was something wrong with that there was a dysfunction, a toxicity somewhere. But
Exactly.
how
Yeah.
that
Even
plays
the
out is
greatest
certainly,
people.
yeah,
Yeah. Even the greatest well-intended individuals that were great, maybe at a different stage of the business or maybe at a future state, it's just
exactly.
where they are in their mindset. If it's not in alignment to that, it can wreak havoc. So
Indeed. Yeah.
yeah. So what advice would you give other entrepreneurs who are struggling to let go and to trust their teams to take on responsibility without compromising that vision?
So the first one is because usually when you say, okay, if they aren't working, fire them, the hardest part and what makes that easier said than done is, are you sure they aren't working? And are you sure they aren't on the verge of cracking the code? So you don't want to fire them a month before they figure it out. You want to give them enough time to get there. So what that means is you've got to have really good, back to our earlier point, a good KPI, good reflection on is how are we defining success and is that person succeeding? And if ultimately you define success and the person isn't succeeding, now you've got a little bit, now it's a little easier in the sense you look out and say, okay, are they going to succeed at this in the next month, 2 months, 3 months? Are we on the verge? Or are they really not going to succeed at that? But if you can't really put it down and say, here's how we've defined success, and they are or aren't hitting this, then it becomes
Mhm.
extraordinarily difficult to make the tough decision to fire that person. Or to
Mm,
change their job or put them in a different role because you don't feel confident enough in that decision because you don't really have the fortitude behind it to make it happen. So I think the first
right.
one is really define that with the team. What is success? What is their success? What role do they have to have? And then you can't let people out of it. Interestingly enough, it's even harder often when the company's doing really well because you don't feel like you have to do it. Whereas when the company's doing poorly, you feel a lot of pressure that, hey, I can at least save this
Hmm.
person's salary or something. But even when the company's doing really well, you still don't want a lot of dead weight. And eventually that dead weight will come back to sink the boat. It may take a little while longer when the company goes through its next down cycle. But I think that's the number one thing is really set the goals and the standards for how you're defining success. And this doesn't have to be a spreadsheet with 30 lines on it. For some people, that success can be very high level. It can be one or two things, but there needs to be some subjective and objective things that you can both define and say, hey, we are or are not
Mm,
seeing success. We're going to
yep.
give it this much more time before we see success. Does everybody agree to that? And if not, let's find an exit strategy.
Yep. So key. Yeah. Tim, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your expertise and your wisdom from this journey as a leader. It's fascinating to see, and I appreciate you sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jill. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening in today. If you'd like to learn more about Tim, you may find him on LinkedIn, Tim Reeser, all one word, Reeser. You can find out more about Savvy Strategic Partners, your trusted outsourced executive leadership team at my website as well, savvystrategicpartners.com. Let's partner together to turn your vision into reality. Thank you so much, and everybody, for being here today.